clinical nutrition and making sense of how things work and how all the biochemistry and physiology becomes relevant is so interesting to me. And then tying that into something that is really tangible for people really worked. But at the same time, the process of nutrition consultation that we go through when we do our evaluation of our patient and turn it into how we help them, it can be quite cumbersome. And I always wanted to see if there was something better we could do there.
Well, welcome to the Pet Food Science podcast, and I have a very interesting guest today, Dr. Farcas. We're going to talk about lots of things, but most interesting, I think, to me is this communication component of trying to get the best information to the people who are actually doing the purchasing, who are nutritionists. So it's going to run to a broad scheme of things, but we'll work through that. Dr. Farcas, could you introduce yourself and tell us how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's taken a bit to get to where I am today. I am in some ways, I still am one of these teenagers who walked into a veterinary clinic and kind of never left. I was 15 when I started working as a receptionist in a small animal veterinary clinic, and it was really kind of I couldn't have asked for a better introduction to veterinary medicine. I got to do every job in the clinic in lots of different ways. And for me, it really was I came for the animals and stayed for the people kind of decision. And I know that's not the case for a lot of us in vet med, but for me, when I applied for veterinary school, there's a requirement in the application for a certain number of letters of recommendation from your professors and your boss, maybe. And I submitted those, but I also had, this story just occurred to me recently after a long time of not thought about it. I had two of my clients from when I was, maybe 18 years old, insist on writing vet school recommendation letters for me, just because of how we had connected and I had helped them understand what was going on with their pet and how meaningful that was to them. And obviously, 18-year-old me did not register the significance of that. But now, sitting here in my 40s, it absolutely blew me away that relationship existed at that time. So that's where things started. I have since held all sorts of positions in all sorts of types of small animal practices. I've worked in referral practices and specialty practices, primarily academia. But after veterinary school, I still was not convinced that I didn't have nutrition on my radar then. Even though my undergrad work was largely nutrition focused, it was just interesting work, but I didn't see it as where I was going. You told me the day I graduated from vet school that I would be anything other than a small animal general practitioner, I would have told you were being silly. But I completed my internship in a small animal specialty referral practice and worked with an internist who had a special interest in nutrition. He'd actually completed a residency and really, really was intrigued by the way he thought about some of his cases. And that's what got me stuck on nutrition. I worked for a small animal general practice for a year before I got into my nutrition residency, and that was it. I was hooked. Clinical nutrition and making sense of how things work and how all the biochemistry and physiology becomes relevant is so interesting to me. And then tying that into something that is really tangible for people really worked. But at the same time, the process of nutrition consultation that we go through when we do our evaluation of our patient and turn it into how we help them, it can be quite cumbersome. And I always wanted to see if there was something better we could do there.
Feed formulation software is stuck in the past. Most tools haven't evolved beyond basic least cost optimization. A Diet Forge changes that. It's an AI-powered platform with nonlinear ingredient modeling for enzymes and additives, cost per gain and maximum profit optimization, and real-time collaboration like Google Docs for nutrition. Every recommendation is grounded in world-class research, built for modern nutritionists who need more than legacy desktop software can deliver. Work seamlessly with your team and optimize the way modern operations demand. Try dietforge.ai free today. Feed formulation, finally modernized.
Well, it's fascinating. So you've talked a lot about, interacting with patients and trying to do optimum health care for them. How does nutrition work into that, do you think?
Oh, it absolutely does. There's the obvious. It's the fuel for everything and the building blocks for what we do. And I think, given who I think the audience of this podcast is, I don't think we have to go too far into that explanation. What I'm kind of more interested in talking about nowadays is how that talking about nutrition is this vital key to building relationships that really work.
Well, that conversation is difficult, isn't it? Because nutrition, you talked a little bit, before we started the podcast, and you've written about how this is not necessarily in the core strength of the veterinarian who's really being looked at as the nutrition expert here. So how is it that they can best, from your perspective, best make that bridge to that conversation and to talking about optimum healthcare, which obviously foundationally is built on really good nutrition?
Yeah, absolutely. Veterinarians are absolute experts in the things that they're experts in, and we don't question their importance and their role. But I think just about every veterinarian would readily recognize that when it comes to the thousands or millions of pet food options and items on the shelves, that they're just not prepared and not able to answer specific questions about any one of them, because it's just such a sheer volume, but also that a lot of times that information is just not available readily. And so I think that if we change the dialogue from, client asks questions to their expert and their expert answers, which is the expectation, and it's quite often falling apart and creating stress on both sides of the equation. If we instead introduce the idea that, hey, this is not actually what I do, but here's how you can approach this. Here's how you can educate yourself. Because most of our pet owners nowadays, especially with nutrition, want to be these really educated, informed consumers that are, tremendous advocates for their pets. And they are, but often they're focusing that advocacy energy sort of in a direction that's less helpful. But if we can teach them a few skills and give them some framework for making great choices in the sense of organizing all of the information they have into what's really truly relevant for their pet, I think that person then becomes this great partner to their pet's care, rather than having this sort of adversarial relationship with their veterinarian because, well, they didn't answer my question, so therefore I can't.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for everybody, I think. I think there's this great knowledge gap, and you sort of touched it. Let's dive a little deeper, because if you just go in and say, I think maybe I'm interested in a weight loss food for my pet, cat or dog. And so then they go to the internet and say, what's a good weight loss food for my pet? The information is at least some wrong and completely overwhelming. So how do you suggest they start moving into that? Here's the best way to educate myself on that information?
Well, the reality is I don't think that answer has existed, which is sort of where I'm going with my work now is I've created it. And not to be too terribly self-promotional, but
No, that's why you're here. Tell us about your work. That's totally okay.
in recognition of this gap, I've built Full Circle Pet Nutrition as a course for pet owners. So it's literally everything that I have that I can share with a pet owner that helps them to ask the questions for themselves that are worth asking when organizing what to do with the answers that they're able to receive. And also along the way, understanding that there will be some questions to which they might not be able to get answers, and that still is information that they can use in making their choices. Their veterinarian absolutely plays a crucial role in that figuring out process, but it's not so much in the prescriptive sort of a way as prescribing a medication for a medical condition would be. It's providing input as to what dietary factors are important to making, from a medical standpoint, to making your next diet choice.
So we want them to see those factors. I just wonder about it. I've heard people say, and I've sort of thought the same thing, after you do, basic understanding of chemistry and physiology, which nutrition is built on, we can have a different conversation. But you're trying to fill that gap with really the information you're bringing. And I just wonder how, what's your experience? How is that working? And what are people telling you about it? And how do the veterinarians see that effort? There's just a lot of facets here, aren't there?
So it hasn't officially launched yet. I'm looking to enroll my first group soon. So this hasn't proven itself yet. What I can tell you is that one of my roles throughout my kind of winding road career has actually been as a hospital director of a different specialty practice. So I married a veterinary dentist, and so I've been involved in a veterinary dentistry practice for a long time. And I, at some point, inserted myself as a role I called hospital director. And among other things, I did a role that was sort of like a hospitalist for this kind of high-touch boutique practice that we had. And again, I spent a lot of time talking to pet owners. I'd screen medical records and sort of compare that patient's suitability as an anesthetic patient against what their treatment needs were. And I'd end up having a lot of conversations with pet owners about, this basic medical physiology thing that we need to understand, like how heart disease interacts with kidney disease under anesthesia, for example. And I'm not their veterinarian. I'm just purely serving an educational role in this point and helping them to understand why, a repeat of an ultrasound or an extra set of lab work might be needed before we proceed with, treating their pet's dental disease, or why treating their pet's dental disease may be important to these other interacting conditions. And, the number of times I got the answer of, what, I've seen a veterinarian 6 times about this condition, and I've never actually had this understood so well. It really made me think that there's room for a purely educational tool. And then obviously being a nutritionist, but also obviously because so many of the diseases that our pets are faced with have nutritional management components, nutrition would also end up coming in there. And I would just have these conversations where people were obviously struggling with having been frustrated by this conversation with their veterinarian, or struggling with having to have figured things out for themselves and sort of getting lost and stuck and overwhelmed. And so that was really the generation of the course, is seeing that demand for needing to be filled. There's And I've actually done all of this before on a sort of different scale, on a one-on-one basis in my consultation practice.
Because that's been sort of the historical route forward, right? Is that we would find an expert and employ them to be that expert so that they could really hone in on the individual and make the best choices. But you're looking for a different answer, right? So you're trying to get the pet owner just to be the one who is established as the expert in that relationship. Is that right?
Well, maybe not established as an expert, but at least increase their level of expertise so they're making competent, basic decisions that they can feel confident in.
Yes.
In my consultation practice, I really found, and I'm speaking of, after I completed my residency and spent some time in academic roles, I came back to California to start veterinary nutrition care, which was my one-on-one nutrition consultation practice. And I really started that as an experiment in business model. It was never going to work or be a successful practice the way I'd founded it. It really was to figure out what the sticking points were to veterinary nutrition in practice. I have always known that there's this huge, what I call perceived demand for nutrition services in practice. But then at the same time, there was really not very many nutritionists in practice. And I can tell you from experience, not very many specialty practices that were ready to go forward and hire one. Right. So it's sort of perceived demand, but not actually ready. And so the practice really proved a lot of things, including that I had basically two groups of clients and patients. One were sort of true specialty patients, where I have a patient with multiple complex internal medicine comorbidities. And that client's goal really is to just find a diet that is medically appropriate for their pet that works, that they'll eat. And in that way, it is more like a typical specialty medicine consultation where I need a prescription, I need a recommendation, and this is outside of the level of depth of my veterinarian. But I also ended up with this other population of clients and patients where the patients had less severe medical conditions and fewer medical conditions. And the clients were really more along the lines of looking for, I just want to know what's best. I just want to do what feels good. And COVID came along and some life things and interrupted my practice. But when I came back to it, I started looking back through old emails and stuff, knowing that the way I run the practice needed some changes. And it struck me a few years later, like it wouldn't have if I had just gone right back to it, that this second group of clients and patients were really looking for empowerment, is the word I use. They're looking to make sense of this confusing, overwhelming pet food aisle where everything screams, I'm the best and everybody else is bad.
Well, I always said I'm the best. I didn't always say everyone else was bad. We go on.
Right. And that's the thing is, certainly there are absolutely pet food marketing is necessary, right? We all need to, if we're making a product, we need to be able to market. I'm here doing marketing. But, the integrity and ethics of which this all happens varies. And I certainly don't even know enough about industry to speak very much about it. But
you see the gap, right? So the gap is that situation where I said it with a smile. I, like everyone else, was saying, I'm responsible for this pet food. I did the nutrition of it. I know the knowing, what we always said, knowing what the ingredients contain, knowing what the products need, and knowing how to put them together. And so, I felt like I was in a process and program where that happened very well. But the consumer can't easily pull that apart. Like, say, I put carnitine in pet food. And I said, I had research showing here's how the benefit is in dogs, here's how the benefit is in cats. But say, for example, you are using, like I have looked at the benefits of a number of plant-based botanicals, and those areas get so broad and the claims get kind of wild, and yet there's a benefit. But how can we help the consumer evaluate something like that?
Well, where I'm starting with is this concept of levels of evidence. So the whole, pyramid structure of.
Let's talk about that. Talk us through those levels of evidence, please. That's interesting.
I absolutely can't do it from memory, but I'll give you the idea. So the levels of evidence is, according to scientific rigor, we have really well-designed, peer-reviewed,
blinded or at least masked randomized studies. That's the highest one, right?
Yep, that's higher up on the pyramid. And things at the bottom are things like case series and case studies and in vitro and theoretical.
The very lowest, and this is said to make you smile, is the consensus of the experts. That's the lowest level of expertise, and yet it's the one we almost always rely on. It's fascinating because you have to build this hierarchy, right? So then above that case report, then there's the sort of, I've published a number of these things, like they're not randomized, they're but I look back and say, look, here's the pets with renal disease and here's what developed. And I think it's very strong science, but it's still not that highest level. And that then that makes it difficult, I think, for the consumer. I have people, I bet you have many more, that come to me and they've had an experience. They've had that one-off, this is what happened to me, and they're absolutely convinced it's normal. It's normalized. Everyone will have that same experience. And that's just unlikely to be true. And that's the difficult thing.
Yeah, so I'm trying to teach people about evaluating things critically, where we, look for where funding is coming from for different projects that may be providing educational material that may actually be marketing material, where we look at what experts are behind different research, and where we just try to figure out if it makes sense.
Let's talk about bias a bit, because that's what we're kicking around here, right? So, for example, when I write a scientific article, I always have to state it's ethically required how I've worked for these different pet food companies. I spent almost 30 years with Hill's Pet Nutrition. I had an excellent experience there, but I worked for Purina. I consult for other people's. What we never talk about, and so I have a strong bias, for example, that I really like omega-3 fatty acids. I put them in most foods that I formulated, and I think, at any ingredient, any nutrition has too much at one end, too little at another. But I think in general, omega-3 fatty acids kind of need to be moved up on that. Let's feed a little more of them. And I like EPA and DHA, specifically. But my point is, I never have to say that bias. I never write and say, I really like DHA. Every time I feed it, I get better cognitive function, better retinal vision, better skin and coat. Here's my bias. It's based on real science. I never tell them that's my bias, all right? I just say, here, look at this wonderful thing that happened. So how do you respond to that? I mean, how do you help somebody understand, everyone has bias, but let's look at those biases.
Well, when it comes to working with clients through this, a lot of times the bias that I'm working with is, pet food is bad, or big pet food is bad, or Hill's, Purina, those guys, they have certain,
Is that based on business is bad, and so I really can't trust business? Big business is even worse, so I really can't trust big business. What's the foundation for that, do you think?
I suspect that some of it may be sort of a move towards, we want smaller, small, this idea that maybe marketing in and of itself, that smaller is better, that a smaller company is going to somehow be able to produce a better product because they're making it in small batches with love versus a giant corporation. And what concerns me about that is I have this fictitious company that I use as an example that is Joe's Garage brand dog food, who Joe's a burnt out corporate executive and was inspired to start making the best pet food possible in his garage. And Joe really, really worries me because he may have a lot of skills when it comes to marketing, and he may have some resources to build a great website and put some interesting social media together to the point where he can develop a following that looks and feels like he's making a good product. And then we have to talk about the definition of quality and what quality means to you and me. But if quality means to me nutrition and food safety, then that becomes kind of expensive in terms of expertise and laboratories and things like that. And I don't know that Joe has the depth of knowledge to be able to do a good job there. And so it does end up being some of an economy of scale to where a larger manufacturer sometimes has a lot more resources to be able to do some of those things better. And so just walking people through this example where, yes, corporation does not necessarily, or large manufacturer does not always necessarily mean high quality either. But I need to also illustrate both ends of that spectrum where the small batch guy may not be doing everything that you think that small batch pet food means.
Well, that's a hard decision. And of course, many people have great success feeding a wide variety of products, some of them that I wouldn't like, right? But it is interesting. I feel like the consumer has, and they go to the internet, they have this, again, it's a bias that I think that may come in that really does miss the advantage of having a team of experts that can all have their individual expertise. I sort of always smile, and I wonder if this has been your experience, but I've had the privilege of knowing some very intelligent, very high quality experts within their area. But even more valuable than that expertise was the understanding of what they didn't know. So, you described things that you should have a food scientist and probably some quality people and a group that would define these areas of expertise beyond what you or I would bring to the party. You as a veterinary nutritionist, I as a nutrition expert. We need a lot more than that. That's probably why you'll never see Dennis's dog food that I make in my garage. I have thought about making individual ingredients, but I haven't done that either, so I don't think I will.
Well, and that's why you'll see me is the only thing I formulate is homemade diets, because this is my area of training, and it's my responsibility to turn quality control over to the one person producing it. So I only have to train one person.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And do you then, like when I look at a number of homemade diets, they're not complete and balanced foods. How do you resolve that for like the trace elements and even the macronutrients of calcium, phosphorus, potassium, those sorts of things? How do you just, in general, how do you do that? And then we're almost at an end here. We may have to have two. I warned you we might have to have two talks. But how would you resolve that in your space? And someone says, I want to make my own food. I'm going to cook for my pet. I'm going to do everything possible. And you sort of say, well, it's different than feeding yourself. How do you work through that?
Yeah. So this is something I would do all the time in my consulting practice, less so recently that I've shifted focus to Full Circle. with the training aspect of things. But I would take software and pull up my dog nutrition dog requirement, or cat, whichever the case may be. And oftentimes in my patient population, I would be making modifications to that. So if I have kidney disease, for example, my phosphorus requirement is going to go way down.
And you start pushing from the upper limit, more important perhaps even than meeting the requirement, right? So that formulation becomes a little more difficult, doesn't it?
Well, in a homemade diet, phosphorus is generally not going to be that particularly high because we're talking about human food items that aren't going to have a whole lot of mineral contamination.
Oh, don't say contamination, please.
I'm sorry.
Mineral content. Got it.
In a human food item, we don't eat the bones most of the time. So we're talking about
striated muscle and probably rice and potato and some of those more what we would consider low phosphorus ingredients.
Yeah. So I would mix and match ingredients to hit all of my proportions of of protein, fat, carbohydrates where I want them. And then using either a veterinary vitamin mineral supplement or a combination of a handful of different human supplements to meet micronutrient and vitamin mineral requirements not provided by the diet's main ingredients. And then the harder part then is writing out that recipe and preparation instructions in a way that is absolutely clear so that my client can't follow the directions wrong.
Tired of navigating the pet food industry alone? The Pet Food Inner Circle brings together the brightest minds in pet nutrition, where seasoned professionals share real insights and tackle the challenges that matter most. When you need answers, industry leaders are just a conversation away. Ready to join the circle? Visit petfoodinnercircle.com and connect with your peers today.
I have been amazed at trying to write those protocols and finding what seems so obvious to me doesn't get communicated. And so I do recognize the difficulty. Well, we're kind of running out of time. I really hope we can talk more because what we haven't really got into is how do we help the consumer evaluate the pet food itself. And it's probably what you're going to say is, well, go to my website. Maybe by that time it'll be up and running and we can talk about that. But I think just talking about it in general would be of value. I wonder if we might just take a minute or 2 minutes to sort of step back and say, Dr. Farcas, you've been in this industry for a while. You've met and dealt with lots of people. What do you look at that says this is an individual that I would be wanting to be on my team or to be the head of a team I would lead? What would you look for in that person?
Oh, that's a great question. I really like someone who is just truly honest about where they are and what they know and what they don't know. I would so much rather have somebody stop and say, hey, wait, this is this way, right? Or do I need to go back and re-understand something else? I think that is such a refreshing perspective relative to, oh, I know this. I've got it. I know everything, and going back and straightening things out earlier. That proactive, let's make sure we're on the same page about what we're doing together, I think is so valuable. And, I try to take that approach with every client I get to talk to.
Well, thank you. That's a great answer. And I sure have, I can cheer that's been, it's been a valuable part of the people I've had the privilege to work with as well. Well, let's call it a day for this one. I hope that we can meet again and sort of dive a little deeper into that. How do we get the consumers, best education, best understanding when they're bombarded with so much information, both from the manufacturer that's trying to sell a product to just what they can get on.
Well, and then there are helpful resources as well that are, variably helpful.
So we'll talk about that again. thanks for our time here. Very much appreciated your joining us and sharing your a little bit of your life story as well as the wisdom you've acquired. So thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. It was nice to meet you.